I got to be honest with you. When I picked a video, I wanted a video to kind of transition me, and I picked that video, and I saw like a small preview, and I said, I think that'll work. And so on Friday, I was making the slideshow, and I used that computer that's back there, and it's a 27-inch screen, so it's fairly big, and I'm only like 2 feet from it. And so I'm watching that video again. I said, I'm going to watch it all the way through. And about 30 or 45 seconds in, I found myself kind of doing this, and then about a minute and a half in, I was like, I'm starting to feel a little sick. So right here in Ohio, I got seasick watching that video. Don't take me to the IMAX. Like I'm awful there. And so I hope that screen was far enough away that nobody got seasick here. But we'll keep going anyway. And I thought about bringing up a table because I got too much junk. I thought you guys would make fun of me for bringing a prima donna, so I'm just going to hold the iPad here, so just go with me here. But I want to start off by taking you guys back. Most of this room can relate, and you young people, you're just going to have to ask your parents about this. I'm going to take you back to the pre-internet era. Like you guys up here, you're like, what? The internet didn't always exist? Pre-internet era. It's defined as pre-1995. All right, so I'm going to talk to you guys. If you did some of your schooling, you weren't even born yet, were you? You were 2. You're making me feel old. I'm going to take you back. If you had most of your schooling done by 1995, you will definitely relate to this. Think back to how you did a term paper or a class project or a book report. Like, where did you spend your time? At the library. You spent a lot of time at the library. School library, community library, whatever. You simply couldn't, pull out your phone and Google the topic at hand. And so where I started, if I had a topic at hand, I would always start with the encyclopedias because they would give me like a short synopsis of the topic. So I can kind of like formulate, okay, here's how I want my paper to go. And by the way, the mark of you were a rich kid in school is that your family had their own set of Encyclopedia Britannicas, right? You guys remember those commercials? I mean, you had to make payments on them suckers. They were expensive. So you knew you had made it if your family had encyclopedias. I did not have encyclopedias at my home, so I can remember full well looking through that card catalog, pulling out, researching, okay, where are these books at? Find the book, and if you had like a bigger library, maybe you had access to like newspaper articles or something, scientific journals, something along those lines. And now with just a few keystrokes, literally, if I wanted to research dolphins, I don't even have to type it. I could be like, hey, Google, show me dolphins, or hey, Siri, right? And you have access to literally, I said, hey, Siri, and it's like.
I'm sorry. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that.
Maybe you can't do it all on the internet, but if it goes through, you have access to literally thousands upon thousands of books, resources. You can view a lot of them online. It's completely different. And now that I'm older, I actually find myself, I enjoy reading. I didn't like to do it as a kid. If you made me read, I'd do it, but I didn't like it. I read a really depressing stat the other day. I want to encourage the guys in here because it's about guys. It says that 80%, it's actually just higher than 80%, of men will never read one single book after high school. Never one single book. Sean is aspiring to that. Is that what you're saying? Right? So now that I'm older, I enjoy reading. I'm not a very, very fast reader. It takes me a long time to read a book, but I'm getting better. And I enjoy it. I'd rather, before bedtime, read and chill than watch TV. I find myself resting better. And when it comes to reading, I myself am a bit old school when it comes to reading. I'm a part of a small group that meets on Wednesday mornings. There's 5 of us now. We just added a person. And what we do is we read books. And we read books on leadership, on the church, on becoming a better Christ follower, all sorts of different books. And here's how it goes. Of those 4 guys, 2 of them will immediately, when we decide on a book, they'll whip out their phone, they'll find an app, and they will download the audiobook. All right? And so two guys do that, and they listen to the book. The other guy, he will also whip out an app, and he will buy the book, and then he reads it on his iPad. Now, then there's me. Now, I also whip out an app called Amazon, and I order myself a book. And then 2 days later, with Prime, it comes to my door, right? I always buy the book. There's something for me, and again, just me, maybe I'm just old. I like having it in my hands and flipping the pages. I used to always joke that a book was like a trophy for me because I don't read very much, and if I finished a book, I want that sucker on my shelf to remind me of how far I've come. Now I read enough that it's not necessarily a trophy, but I still like to have it in my hands. I like to mark up the pages. You know, if I see a thought that I really like, I'm like, here's my pen, let me underline this. I write in the margins. I like to do it. For me, marking it up helps me retain more information. This Bible here, it's all beat up. This was given to me as a present as a junior in high school in 1996 by somebody very special, and I have written all over this thing. And I'm not saying that because I'm like, oh, he reads the Bible a lot. No, like this is 20 years worth of reading. And so every page has, something on it. It actually has a built-in devotion, which is really, really cool. So every single page is wide margin. Every page has like a couple questions regarding the text on that page. And so in college, I decided, you know what, I'm going to use this as my main devotion. And so every page has a date. Where I'm at today, I used this for a lot of years and then went away from it, came back 25th of August, 2011. And so it's pretty cool that I can come back and see my thoughts on that text. I also don't, I know some people do it here, use a bulletin to write your sermon notes on. I just, wide margin of the Bible, man, I just write them in there. And that way I can come back when I'm reading it and it's like, oh, this is what I thought about it. This is really cool. And in fact, a lot of my notes that are in there went into this sermon today, which is really cool. 9 years later, then I'm able to still use it. I love coming back. And speaking of reading, when I was younger, I remember kids in my class. All right, not me. I was an angel. I was an angel kid. I remember kids in my class going to the library and getting Cliff Notes. Do you guys remember Cliff Notes? If I remember right, I want to say they were like yellow books, like yellow and black. And there was a couple of different brands out there, but I remember Cliff Notes, and I can't remember the other brands for the life of me. And basically, so if you don't know what they were, they basically take a literary work, like let's say like Of Mice and Men. I had to read that in school. And they would take that and they would say like, okay, what are the main points, main characters? And they would boil it down to, 25, 30 pages-ish. And so you could read that and probably do well enough on a book report. So it just boils it down. In fact, I actually just saw, so I don't even know if Cliff Notes are still around. I just saw an ad just this week on Facebook, on my feed. There was an ad, and it targeted business professionals and CEOs. So I have no idea why it was on my newsfeed. But it targets them, and it says, here's what the service does. It takes the best of the leadership books out there and sales training and all those books, and it puts it down to 15 minutes of audio. So that on your way into work, you can listen to a book in 15 minutes. And I guess that's kind of the modern version of Cliff Notes, I guess. I guess that's what they do. And we're going to be in the book of Mark today. And the book of Mark was long thought to be just that, Cliff Notes. You had the book of Matthew. Well, the book of Mark is very close to what's in the book of Matthew. The book of Mark is the shortest gospel that we have, and it's sort of just the facts. And so for a long time throughout church history, actually the book of Mark was overlooked because people said, well, if you want to study Mark, you might as well just read Matthew. It expands on a lot of those thoughts. As it turns out, historians have actually found out that Mark was the very first gospel written of the four gospels. It was written about 30 years after the resurrection of Christ. So it was written using eyewitness accounts, and it was written in the lifespan of people who are still alive. So if those facts were wrong, people could have easily stepped up and said, well, no, I was there. This is not how it went down. So now it's flipped, where Mark is regarded, because of its historical accuracy, Mark is regarded as something that you want to study. Like it's not something you want to skip over. And so we're going to be in Mark chapter 4. Verses will be on the screen for you guys. But before we get to where we will be, I want to just kind of tell you what happens in chapter 3, kind of catch you up to speed. In chapter 3, Jesus had started attracting large crowds. He was healing a lot of people. Everybody from the entire area was coming to see him. He was teaching. He was doing a ton of things. And he also confronted the religious leaders a lot. And I remember as a kid, I really loved this. I just had a problem with authority, I guess. I was like a total punk. And like even like church authority, right? And so here he's confronting some of these religious leaders. And I'm like, yeah, Jesus, yeah. And but he's confronting like wrong religious leaders. Like I was just a punk. Like I wasn't, that wasn't what I was doing. And so he's working so hard in chapter 3 that his own family, his own family comes, and they come to where he's preaching and teaching, and he's in a house, and they're like, Jesus, you're going crazy. Why don't you take a break, come back with us back home, and just relax for a little bit. You're burning the candle at both ends. And that didn't work because Jesus knew that his time on earth was short, and he had a lot to do, so he wasn't going to come home and rest. And so chapter 4 opens with, we're going to be at the end of chapter 4, but I just want to read verse 1 for you out of chapter 4 just to set the scene here. And verse 1 says this, "And again he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. The crowds had become so big that they're pressing forward to hear him, to see him, to touch him. They want to touch him because they know that they can be healed. So the crowds are huge. It was so much that Jesus had to step back and get into a boat and go out on the water, possibly for his safety, and possibly so the whole crowd could actually see him and maybe hear him because he wasn't surrounded. And so he's out on a boat on the water, and now we're going to pick up in verse 35, and we're going to read a few verses there. It says, "On the same day when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side.' Now when they left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, 'Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?' And they feared exceedingly, and said to one another, 'Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Jesus had a long day of teaching. We started in verse 1 that showed him with the crowd, and now we're ending this chapter with him just finishing teaching. A long day by the crowd of the sea, and he taught them in parables. And actually, Mark chapter 4 has some of the most famous parables that we have. If you guys know the parable, it's called the parable of the sower. I like to call it the parable of the soils. And it's about the farmer casting out seed, and it falls on different types of soils. That's one of the more famous parables. That's found in Mark chapter 4 here. And he also uses the parable about the mustard seed, about faith incredibly small, and how the mustard seed grows so big. That's also in Mark chapter 4. And in fact, Jesus, of the recorded teachings that we have, he spoke in parables about 1/3 of his teachings. It's actually 35% of his teachings are spoken parables. Anytime there was a large crowd involved, he always spoke in a parable. And so a parable, just by the way, it's kind of a churchy word. If you don't know what that is, it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Just simply that. I had a mentor in my life. He's a great guy. And he was a Sunday school teacher for me for a while. And he always said this about his teaching. He said, quote, "I put the cookie jar on the bottom shelf where I can reach them." In other words, what my mentor Ron was doing and what Jesus was doing is he would teach in a way that everybody could understand and that everybody can relate to and that everybody can kind of get something from. And that was the point of the parables, just to relate it down to the people. And so after teaching this large crowd, he withdrew with just his disciples. Now, he was in the boat. I'm assuming he stayed in the boat. And so the crowd dispersed. And so at this point, now he began teaching the disciples, and he went in more depth with what he was talking about. In fact, a lot of times you'll see that happen. He'll teach a large crowd, and then he'll teach his disciples kind of more in depth about what he just talked about. And so he explained, the parables in more detail. And then now evening had come. This is where we pick up our story. Now evening had come. Jesus said, "Let's take our boats and sail to the other coast." And this is the big body of water, all right? We're not talking about like, oh, I see Dave waving on the other shore. Like this is, you can't see it, right? So this is a journey to get there. And I've heard these verses talked about, and there's even songs written about this story. I've heard this talked about in a way that explains it as, Jesus will get us through any storm, right? And that's like a good takeaway from this. But I hope that after we go through these verses today, I hope that you would see that that's not the main point of this story. It's something else I want you to get. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 takeaways regarding this story that I want you to see. Number 1, I want you to see the human side of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus. The Bible teaches, and we affirm, that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. Don't ask me how that works, all right? 200% doesn't, but he's 100% man and he's 100% God. The only qualification on his humanity is that he never sinned. He was free from sin. He lived a perfect and sinless life. And some verses, just to back this up, they'll be on the screen, but if you want to jot them down, you don't have to turn there. I'm going to go through them quick. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin." Both his human side and his divine side are on display in this story, but it's first that we see his human side. He had been teaching all day long, both to the great crowd and then to his disciples further, and they get in the boat, and Jesus falls asleep. He's tired. You can't pour into others without emptying of yourself. I'll say it again. You can't pour into others without emptying of yourself. This is why some jobs are a little bit tougher than others, or they wear you out. You know, if you're dealing with kids or say a teacher, right? A teacher is pouring themselves out into their classroom, or a good teacher is, all day long, and that really wears you down, right? And so he's tired. Verse 38 tells us that Jesus was in the stern asleep on a pillow. He's worn out. He's so worn out, and he's sleeping so hard that the storm around him didn't wake him. He's still asleep. The Gospels show us the humanity of Jesus on a number of occasions. And I won't read these verses for you for time's sake, but in Matthew 4:2, we see that he got hungry. In Mark 3:5, he got angry. On John 11:35, some of you may know that as the shortest verse in the Bible, he cried. It says he wept. On the cross, he died. Here in our story, we see a Jesus that poured so much into others that it drained him physically, and he was tired as a result. Lottie Moon, some of you may know that name. Lottie Moon was a much celebrated Baptist missionary to China. I think the late 1800s, so a while back, and she has this quote, and I love this quote. She says this: "I have a firm conviction that I am immortal till my work is done." While nowhere near as eloquent to say, I was saying just like it. I say this: if there is breath in my lungs, God still has work for me to do. And it's true. Jesus knew that his time had not yet come, so he was able to rest comfortably and peacefully in this stern while the storm is around him because he trusted in his heavenly Father. So the second thing I want you to take away is the disciples' reaction to the storm. They kind of messed this up a little bit. The disciples, they probably had a long day as well. All right, so they were helping Jesus, maybe with crowd control. They rounded up the boats, whatever they had to do. They were intently listening. They probably had a long day as well, and they were probably tired. Some of them were maybe even asleep in the boat. We don't know. But we do know that they woke up with the storm. And we do know that this storm, it arose very, very quickly, and it was a major storm. And how do we know this? Because some of those guys in the boat, they're seasoned sailors. They did this for a living. They fished. They were out on the water all the time, and yet they're freaking out. They're panicking. So we know that this is not a little storm. This is a major storm. In fact, it says that the winds were so great that they were knocking the waves over the boat and into the boat, and the boat was filling up. So we're probably talking about hurricane-force winds here. And it wasn't just the boat that Jesus was on. I don't know if you caught that in our verses there. Scripture says that there were other little boats with them. So some of that crowd probably got in their own boats, and they wanted to follow Jesus to the other side. So there is a flotilla of boats in the middle of the storm. And panic is a natural human reaction when things are dire. Like when your life is on the line, that fight or flight kicks in, and a lot of people, they panic. It's a natural reaction. But these guys, they had Jesus on the boat, and they're still panicking. Right before their own eyes, they've marveled at his control and his knowledge of Scripture and his wisdom. Right before their own eyes, they've seen miraculous by this point, from the seemingly little turning water into wine to the completely healing and instant restoration of people with all different types of ailments. They've seen that right before their own eyes. They've even already to this point witnessed Jesus have complete control over a demon and cast the demon out of a person. They've seen all of these things right before their own eyes. They've already seen the divine side of Jesus, but now in this moment, instead of trusting the divine, their eyes see the humanity of Jesus. They're forgetting who is on the boat with them. And in a panic, they wake Jesus up. And in verse 38, they don't just wake him up, they accuse him. They say, do you not care that we are perishing? Things are getting pretty real here, Jesus. Our lives are in danger. We might die. Do you not care? They question his concern and his love for them. And instead of exhibiting faith in the one who have proven himself trustworthy already, they lash out at him. The third thing I want you to see is Jesus the divine. Sometimes it makes Amber incredibly mad that if I come home from work and I come home and the kids are just wild, I can sometimes go in and just with the word, commotion stops. And it drives her nuts because she can't do that. Sometimes my voice commands authority over my kids. Sometimes it does not. But sometimes it does. And it usually looks like this. I'll come in and I usually say, that's the last time I'm going to tell you to stop. The dad voice comes out a little deeper. You know what I mean? You just stern. And in fact, the other day, we were going to McDonald's. My grandmother sent the kids McDonald's gift cards for Valentine's Day. And it had just been a rough day. One of those days where I come home and Amber's like, kids are out of control. It's nuts. I'm like, well, hey, maybe this will help. Let's get out of the house. Let's go to McDonald's. Kids are fighting. And I tell them all before we leave, I said, look, shape up or you're not going to go. And the girls, they shaped up right away. They wanted McDonald's. The boys, on the other hand, were in the car and we're heading to McDonald's. And I live literally 5 minutes from McDonald's. We're on the way and they are fighting. I tell them, I said, that's the last time that I'm going to tell you to stop. And sure enough, what they do, they kept going. So I turned that car right around and I got in my driveway, opened the door and I said, get out. Y'all are staying home. So I'm taking the girls to McDonald's, but y'all don't get to go. And they threw a fit, but hey, they didn't stop. So you have to follow through. I think that's one of the important things on parenting. We make these threats, but if you don't follow through, they see right through that, right? So it hurt me to do that, but hey, they shaped up. And most of the time, it's all it takes is me to say a word because the kids know that I'm a man of my word. They know that if I need to intervene again, that there will be consequences. Usually it's painful consequences for their rear end, but they know there's consequences coming. And this one, I learned this one from my dad. And I use this. Parents, this one's fantastic. If I was supposed to be cleaning my room and my dad figured out that I wasn't, here's what would happen. I would hear him from down in the kitchen, and he would yell up there in kind of a chill way. He'd say, don't worry, I'm coming up. I'll help you clean it. And then I'd immediately hear the whoosh, and that was the trash bag opening up. Like, how when you get a trash bag out, whoosh, whoosh. And I heard that, and I was like, oh, crap. Everything I hold dear to my life is about to hit the trash can. And he was a man of his word because he did that one time. All I needed to hear was that snap of the trash bag, and I would start cleaning as fast as I can. So I use that with my kids, and it seems to work. But you got to follow through. You got to be willing to throw some stuff out sometimes. So I have authority over my kids sometimes. And here we see Jesus with his authority with just a spoken word. We see the divine nature of Jesus. Verse 39, it says, then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. It was a simple, non-magical statement. He said, peace, be still. It didn't take any special incantations or spells. He just had authority. And immediately the response of both the wind of the sea was immediate because their master had spoken. This right here is the full deity of Christ on display. Hurricane-force winds are stopped with just the word, peace, be still. Only God can do this, and Jesus is fully God. And that is the point of this story. The main point of this story. We can learn and take away something and apply it to our lives, sure, but we are not the focus of this story. Jesus is. And that is exactly what the disciples needed to know at this point. They needed to know, they've already seen miracles, that this is not simply a miracle worker, but this is God who is standing in front of them. That was the point of this story in their lives. As we work toward a conclusion on this sermon, we can talk about storms. Storms and trials will come. You guys know that. If you're over 5 years old, you know that. It's not an if, but a when. And it's not whether or not you know Jesus. That doesn't matter. Trials are going to come, and the storms will be there. After rebuking the storm, Jesus turns to his disciples, and he says this. He says, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? He's rebuking them in a mild way. Jesus could have, when they wake him up and accuse him, Jesus could have brought hellfire down and be like, fine, done. But he rebukes them, but in a very mild way. And he asks them why they're afraid. In the midst of this storm, instead of having faith in Jesus, they accuse him of not caring for them. We, on the other hand, don't really have any excuses. The Bible, this book tells us everything. Everything we need to know, God has given us right here. We know that Jesus is all-powerful and he's all-knowing. We know that he has saved us from our sin. We know that he died and he rose again. We know that he can be trusted in absolutely no matter what the situation is. And unfortunately, many times, and I think you can probably relate, that instead of trusting him in the storm, I accuse him of not caring. I'm just like the disciples. Genesis 50:20, towards the end of Genesis, I don't think it's on the screen, but it's the story of Joseph. At the end of the story of Joseph, when Joseph confronts his brothers who had sold him into slavery, he says this statement. He says, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." What Satan means for evil, God can use for good. Trials and difficulties are divine appointments to strengthen our faith. I'm not saying that God puts all those trials and storms in your way. In fact, if we're honest, I think that we put most of our trials and storms in our own way by decisions that we make, or certainly it could be Satan doing it as well. But God can take evil and use it for good. We were talking in our small group about how that when we go through something hard, that then we are able to help somebody else through a very similar situation. And sometimes that may be the point of that trial, is that God wanted to use you in somebody else's life. God has to work in you before he can work through you. I heard that quote at a conference recently. God has to work in you before he can work through you. Maybe that's the point of the storm. God's working in you so that he can then work through you in somebody else's situation. So how do we respond to this story? Same way the disciples did, by answering a question. Verse 41 says, "And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, 'Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?' They were afraid when they saw the power of God in front of them, but a healthy fear, like a reverent fear. And then they asked the question, 'Who is this man? Who is this man, Jesus, who commands the wind and the sea?' Peter figures it out in chapter 8, just a few chapters away. Jesus asks Peter, he says, 'Who do you think I am?' And Peter says, 'The Messiah, the Christ.' Peter's figured it out. Unfortunately for the rest of them, they don't really figure it out until after the resurrection. And then they figure it out that this is God. So this storm was a divine appointment for these disciples. This storm was put into their path so they can come to terms with and answer this very question, who is this man? And this is the same question that we got to answer today. One day you will stand before Jesus and he will either say, 'Well done, my good and faithful servant,' or he will say, 'Begone, I never knew you.'" That's a scary thing. That's a scary thought. One day we are going to be faced with that. "Begone, I never knew you." And it comes down basically to this question. How do we answer this question in our lives? I believe it's C.S. Lewis. He says that Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. He's one of those three things. He can't be more than one, and he's only one of those three things. And you have to answer that in your life. I looked at the evidence, and I've looked at it, and I said that Jesus is my Lord. All right, so then one day when I do see Jesus, I will see, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Heaven is open to you. That's an important question. It's not one you can put off. Putting it off is answering it. All right, if you put it off, you're not saying that Jesus is Lord. You're saying that he's one of the other two, a liar or a lunatic. So as we go to prayer today, I want you guys to be thinking of that question. Number one, is that a question that you've already answered? Can you say, "Yes, I've answered this question, and here was my answer. Jesus is blank." Fill it in. Think about your answer. If you can't say that you've ever answered that question, today's the day to answer it. So we're going to go ahead and bow together. So if you bow with me.